This is part 3 of a presentation I originally gave at the 2020 Sunstone Symposium. Part 3, Other Romanisms in the Book of Mormon. It's easy to see similarities between Mormon and several Roman historians. Besides being a historian, Mormon was a general and a prophet. An obvious Roman counterpart is Julius Caesar, one of the great generals of world history, who was also chief priest of the Roman state religion and an important historian in his own right. His election to Pontifex Maximus, a lifetime appointment, occurred in the same year as the Second Catilinarian Conspiracy. Sallust and Tacitus also fit this mold somewhat as statesmen historians who held religious positions or military commands, but on a smaller scale than Caesar. In Understanding the Book of Mormon, Grant Hardy discusses several embedded documents in the Book of Mormon. Among these, he lists 8 letters and as many as 17 speeches. Sallust and Tacitus both commonly presented letters and speeches in their respective histories as well. One particular letter in Sallust's Histories bears a striking resemblance to Moroni's letter to Pahoran in Alma chapter 60. Pompey was fighting a war in Spain and in 75 BC sent a letter to the Senate excoriating them for their lack of financial support for the war effort. Quote, "You have done your best to destroy me by hunger, the most wretched death of all. Was it with this expectation that the Roman people sent its children to war? Are these the prices for wounds and for blood spilled so often on account of the Commonwealth?" Close quote. He threatened to return to Rome with his army. Quote, "If you do not come to our aid, my reluctant prediction is that the army, and with it the whole war in Spain, will transfer to Italy." Close quote. Captain Moroni also wrote an angry and fiercely critical letter to the government during a brutal campaign. He directed it to the chief judge and to, quote, "all those who have been chosen by this people to govern and manage the affairs of this war." Like Pompey, he complained bitterly of hunger and other afflictions and accused the government of neglecting the war effort. And also like Pompey, he threatened to bring his army back to the seat of government if they did not send help. Moroni sent his letter in about 62 BC. So here's the side-by-side comparison of these letters. One written by a Roman general, the highest military officer in the land, and one written by a Nephite chief captain, the highest military officer in the Nephite world. Pompey's letter was sent to Rome, the capital, from the field in the Roman province of Hispania, or Spain. Moroni's letter was sent to the capital Zarahemla from the field in outlying Nephite lands. Pompey's letter was directed to the Senate. Moroni's letter, interestingly, was directed to the chief judge and other government officials in charge of managing the war. We don't seem to hear a lot about anything besides the chief judges or the other judges when it comes to Nephite government, but we do in this case. Both letters had a very angry and critical tone, and the contents were very similar. They both complained of hunger, lack of soldiers, and other hardships. They both accused the government of neglecting the war effort, and they both threatened to bring the fight back home if help wasn't provided. Pompey's letter was sent in 75 BC, and Moroni's letter in about 62 BC. So once again, we see a very close timing of parallel events. Okay. Conclusion. It has been popular among some scholars and many Book of Mormon critics to see everything in the Book of Mormon as a reflection of Joseph Smith's environment. From the point of view of the apologist, on the other hand, there seem to be abundant connections to the ancient Near East and ancient American civilizations, particularly those from Mesoamerica. It seems that both sides are determined to see what they want to see. So what are we to make of the Romanisms in the Book of Mormon? In my opinion, they are too numerous, too specific, and too clustered to dismiss as mere coincidences. Sallust and Tacitus could have conceivably been available to Joseph Smith, but are we to believe he read these classical sources and weaved parts of them into a story of his own creation, or that in the translation process he unconsciously or otherwise expanded on the underlying Nephite text with stories from classical history? It seems more likely that someone else more knowledgeable and capable than Joseph is responsible for the Romanisms in the Book of Mormon. But who? Recent scholarship indicates that the original language of the Book of Mormon is largely consistent with early modern English from about the 1530s to the 1730s. Building on this early modern theme, Royal Skousen lists 10 issues within the Book of Mormon that Protestants were dealing with in the 16th and 17th centuries. These apparent early modern connections to the Book of Mormon are puzzling. A potential ancient Roman connection is no less puzzling. Consider for a moment, though, that Latin was the lingua franca of early modern Europe, and that the study of ancient Roman literature and history was an integral part of education in European universities. Sallust was the most popular ancient historian throughout early modern times, with Catiline's War being the most published work. Tacitus's popularity was not as consistent throughout the entire period, but during the last quarter of the 16th century, as religious and civil wars plagued Europe, the Tacitus approach to history gained popularity as a way of viewing events. Tacitus became the most prominent ancient historian of the 17th century. Several early modern historians, particularly from the Netherlands, imitated the Tacitian style in their histories. Perhaps the Romanisms in the Book of Mormon are additional evidence supporting the idea that the Book of Mormon is in some way connected to the early modern world. I now want to answer a couple of the questions that I got at the Sunstone Symposium. One of the questions: are you aware of anyone else who has found these parallels between the Gadianton robber wars and the Roman conspiracies? As far as I know, nobody else has pointed out the parallels specifically with Tacfarinas and with Catiline. There are some papers that have looked at the Sicarii, the Zealots, the defenders at Masada, and events generally around the 1st century AD. I think John Welch has a paper on this, and there are others who have talked about that, but I have not seen anything related, as I said, to Catiline and to Tacfarinas as far as the Book of Mormon is concerned. Okay, another question. How did you first discover these parallels? Well, I first got interested in this actually from the work of Skousen and Carmack, who have pointed to an early modern connection based on the language and syntax of the Book of Mormon. I was convinced by the papers that I read that there really is some sort of connection. And so I began to research early modern history to try and see if early modern history could shed some light on what was in the Book of Mormon. That ended up actually being a very profitable endeavor. I got other research that's ongoing that I will probably write some other papers about to address some of the things that I found. But one of the things that I found in studying early modern history was that in the early modern time, the scholars were really obsessed, I guess, with Roman history and drew on it quite a bit. And it was actually in researching what some of the early modern people had to say about war that I came across the story of Tacfarinas and started to look into it. There was a work by Hugo Grotius on the laws of war. I think it was published about 1625, and I was reading that and noticed a lot of parallels actually between how Grotius sees that war ought to be conducted and how the Nephites conducted their wars. And I came across Tacfarinas, and it reminded me of the Gadianton robbers, and so I went to the primary sources to understand it a little bit better and realized that there was a lot in common with the Gadianton robbers. Based on that, I started to look into some of the other ancient Roman sources. I really just did some simple searches on the word latro, but on the underlying Latin text as I began to understand that word a little bit more. And that's where I came across Cicero's speeches, where he condemns Catiline and really the stories of the Catiline conspiracies. And so again, I went to the source text, which is mostly Sallust, who provides the greatest amount, but there are other snippets from other historians, and then you can also look at a series of speeches that Cicero delivered. There are 4 orations against Catiline, as they're called, that gives extra context and information on those events. So that's how I came to discover these parallels. One thing I forgot to comment on is this depiction of Captain Moroni versus this depiction of a 1st century BC Roman general. Now that general is actually supposed to be Crassus, but Crassus and Pompey were contemporaries. Remember, they were in the first triumvirate along with Caesar. So the uniform and the weaponry and armor and everything worn here, I think, is at least a modern understanding of how a Roman general from that time period would have been dressed. It's real interesting to me that Captain Moroni is shown in virtually the same gear, the same sword and helmet, similar breastplates and all the other things that you can see there. There's a few differences. I don't see a shield with Crassus, but I gotta think that Freeburg, when he painted this, that he had in his mind these Roman battles, that probably as he read the Book of Mormon, that's what was brought to his mind was these Roman battles. And so he's a very careful artist, and as he depicted Captain Moroni here, I think it was probably intentional that he made him out to be a Roman general. He's been criticized at times for his anachronistic Book of Mormon paintings, but maybe he got it right here. Maybe he knew something that we didn't know.